All right, Eric, stand by. I want to add to this conversation. We're joined in the New York studio by Ryan Mauro, who is the national security analyst for the Clarion Project, and he's been with us through this entire process as the president has laid forth a plan to combat ISIS. Ryan, thank you so much for coming back in. Let's start with what part of the big news of the day, beside this UN Security Council meeting that Secretary of State John Kerry is heading, and that is that France launched their first airstrikes. They announced that they would yesterday, and then now they have done it. How significant is that?
It's significant because it allows the U.S. government to push back against criticism saying that this isn't a real coalition, that you announce that there's over 40 countries involved, but what are they really contributing? And that's the major criticism right now. And part of John Kerry's speech, the Secretary of State, today was emphasizing that maybe we're defining coalition wrong, because the expectation wasn't that countries in the region and that Europe were going to be sending in forces into Iraq for us. We're talking about intelligence cooperation, countries allowing us to use their airspace for the air raids, and different forms of cooperation. But being able to say that France carried out airstrikes and is involved in the actual fighting, that's a powerful argument for the administration to make. Indeed, and in fact, France's President François Hollande also said that more would be coming. And I imagine, you tell me if my imagination is right or wrong, but he said that on purpose to signal the ongoing participation and support of the country in this coalition. That's exactly right. And no one was really expecting the surrounding countries to carry out airstrikes for us or to send in ground forces. But that's a lot of the criticism that we're hearing. But I think that there is a lot to brag about with the coalition. Indeed. Let me swing back out to Frank. Is he still out there at the UN? See if we can go back out and talk to him. Frank, are you still there?
Yes, we are.
Okay, Frank, I want to ask you just about some of the speakers. The foreign minister of Rwanda made a very impassioned speech, talked about the genocide of 1994 and the importance of the international community addressing a threat when they see it before it gets out of control. Sometimes at these meetings you don't see passion, but we certainly did in that case, did we not?
Yeah, yes, you really did, and I think one of the things she was really trying to stress and point out to people is that, you know, the terrorism infects everyone. It is a problem. Of course, you know, North Africa has long been a breeding ground for terrorist groups and a safe haven. And, you know, she's worried about this because she sees what's going on in neighboring countries, and she realizes that, you know, this could really infect the rest of the continent. So, you know, it's not that they're not just battling the Ebola outbreak there, they're battling a terrorism and terrorists that have really been in other nations, had safe havens in North Africa, and they've been free to move about there. So it's not just what's going on in Iraq. And she realizes if it can happen in Iraq, where the U.S. government went in and supposedly, you know, cleared the place of terrorists, and now they're all back again, that this could certainly really affect her and the rest of the international community.
And Eric Ham, who's joining us from Washington, D.C., did you get the idea, particularly from her remarks, that perhaps there is a wish for even more financial support than's been committed so far, and that holy grail of ground troops that, of course, President Obama says will not happen?
Sure. Actually, I think her comments certainly moved the needle for more engagement. And like your guest said there, it's great that France has actually made this move and actually committed to and gone through on airstrikes. But her comments today were, I think, very crucial, because what they did was they actually showed you what it's like to actually go through a situation like this, where you have just a marauding band of terrorists who are actually just committing mass atrocities. And her talking about how, as a country, they felt alone. I mean, I thought this was a very impassioned speech, and I'm hopeful that her comments will galvanize many of the nations that are there in New York meeting this week to actually begin to put more meat on the bone, if you will, going forward.
Ryan, let me ask you this question. I'm hopscotching around just a little bit. I want to go back to these airstrikes. Of course, the United States, I believe, Central Command has said that the United States has made 176 airstrikes since this began in early August, and there are more to come. France has joined in there. But I want to talk about the intelligence that is so central to making these airstrikes first of all, precise, but also to limit the collateral damage. How and where, if you will, is the U.S. dependent upon the ground intelligence to make these airstrikes the most effective?
Entirely. You get intelligence from the Kurds, from the Iraqis on the ground. They are the ones that are geographically in the position to get informants that will say, there's an ISIS guy hiding in this house, you need to take care of him. But at the same time, you also have to have CIA and different U.S. personnel on the ground to vet that intelligence. And so that's what I'm thinking of when John Kerry says that there's a role for Iran in Iraq, because what type of role is that? If Iran's willing to provide intelligence about ISIS, sure, you should consider it. But are we talking about military cooperation? That's when things get more difficult.
I'm so glad that you brought Iran up. That's where I want to take this conversation with all three of you gentlemen. This is a very complicated position, both for the United States and how it is seen in terms of cooperating or collaborating with Iran, as well as Iran's own interests in the area.
Right. So Iran may say that they hate ISIS, but at the same time, Bashar Assad, Iran's ally, and Iran also benefit from the rise of ISIS because they want that to be the alternative to Bashar Assad. They do not want there to be a moderate alternative. And so while it is tempting to embrace the Iranian regime, everyone agrees that we need the Iraqis, the Sunnis, and the Shiites to come together. And if the Sunnis see signs of Iranian influence, particularly among the Iranian-backed militias that kill Sunnis all the time and persecute them, they're not going to cooperate because the Sunnis are more afraid of the Iranians than they are even of ISIS.
Indeed, and talk a little bit more, and sort of Iran's complicated position in all of this, and in the region also underpins some of Turkey's hesitations. Is that not true?
That is true. Turkey is obviously worried about Kurdish influence, but also Turkey is on more of the Islamist side of things. They are backing Hamas, they're backing the Muslim Brotherhood, and so that's where they're going to invest their resources if they are ever part of this coalition. And indeed, we're already seeing moderates among the Syrian opposition complaining of that. Guys that we would like to be seen as strong are saying, well, your supposed allies like Turkey and Qatar are sidelining us.
All right, let's go back out to Frank Uciardo, our Arise News UN correspondent who is outside the United Nations, just down the street, quite frankly. We're talking about Iran. Frank, were they at the meeting, and what is their role at this particular meeting?
Well, basically, they're here for the beginning of the General Assembly, but also, you know, they're going to be speaking, and they want to show their support, of course, against terrorism, but you know, there is the point that they have been accused by the State Department of being a big supporter of terrorists in the region and trying to destabilize the region. And, you know, we were talking about Iraq a little earlier. You know, you have to go back to the beginning of the Iraq war with this whole terrorism business, because you had the U.S. State Department asking the Turks not to come across the border. The Turks wanted to invade into Iraq to go after the Kurds and go after some of the rebel groups at that time. And, you know, what's interesting now is some people are thinking maybe that wouldn't have been such a bad idea, because the Turks would have been in there to try to intercept some of the breeding grounds for the terrorists that were in Iraq at the time. And then, of course, you have to remember who was supplying the weapons to the terrorists and a lot of the rebel groups in the region, and that points back to Iran. That, of course, according to the U.S. State Department.
Indeed. And Ryan, let me ask you this. Of course, all of this hinges upon a stable government in terms of fighting ISIS, particularly as it relates to its onslaught in Iraq. It relies on a stable coalition government in Iraq itself. Do you have faith in the government that's just newly been put together?
I don't have a lot of long-term faith, but for now, it seems like even the Sunnis are willing to cooperate with the Iraqi government. There are Sunni tribes that are already collaborating with them against ISIS. And so that relationship of trust, there is a foundation for it. But to my earlier point, one of the problems we're facing is that the Iraqi government is using Iranian-backed militias that are going in and fighting ISIS. And so the Kurds are saying, we're fighting the Islamic State, but at the same time, what they call the Shiite Islamic State, the Iranian-backed militias, are going to be their next adversary and are creeping in on their influence.
I want to gauge your concern about an issue. As I understand it, one of the very influential Shiite clerics, Grand Ayatollah Allah al-Sistani, on Friday urged vigilance against Western political interference in Iraqi affairs, stopped short of saying that he would not support this U.S.-led coalition. But how much, and he's not the only one that has expressed that kind of concern. How much of that how much is that a concern to the effort of this coalition to degrade and destroy ISIS?
It's a big concern, but what does he mean by Western influence? If he's inferring that there might be combat boots on the ground, that may be what he's addressing, because the airstrikes and the humanitarian aid that the U.S. is involved in, that's popularly supported by the Shiites, the Kurds, and even the Sunnis. We're not seeing protests in the streets of Iraq against it. What he may also be reacting to is that there are, again, Iranian-backed militias that said, if American combat boots come in, we're going to jump on them and fight them. There is a Sunni group, a militant group, that is fighting ISIS, that has said the same thing. And so when you talk about the issue of mission creep, if the U.S. were to get involved by sending in combat forces, you're not just fighting ISIS anymore. It's going to spread.
Indeed, indeed. Let me hop back over to Eric Ham, who is in Washington, D.C. Eric, let me ask you about this. Of course, we just reported this week that the authorities in Australia uncovered a plot of ISIS supporters, sympathizers, if you will, had a plan to kidnap an innocent random individual and perform a public beheading. Because of surveillance, they were able to arrest many of these people, hopefully all of them. Does that plot then indicate that ISIS is really more of a threat to the U.S. than we have indicated so far?
Actually, I think what that does is I think it shows what the coalition that's coming together to actually combat ISIS means to ISIS. I think ISIS is now beginning to feel very threatened. And you're seeing this ramped up social media campaign, because I think they recognize that a number of countries are coming together to come after them. And Australia has been very active. They've supported this endeavor. They've pushed for enormous amounts of humanitarian aid to the region, and also military aid as well. And so I think Australia was just one of the first dominoes that ISIS saw that it could get to. Now, of course, there's always concern about ISIS, given its enormous financial infrastructure, to actually be able to reach beyond the Middle East into Western nations like Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. But I think it's more of a response to the threat that ISIS is beginning to feel, more so than can they actually make it happen in terms of reaching out and actually attacking the nations, the Western nations in the homeland.
Ryan, you want to add?
Sure. I agree that it is ISIS reacting to the pressure, but at the same time, up until now, a lot of the conversation about the terrorist threat of ISIS is focused on their sympathizers or individuals that go overseas, get the training, come back, and act on their own. What's interesting about the plot in Australia, where they wanted to behead someone publicly, is that that was initiated on the orders of someone over in ISIS in the Middle East. And so we're seeing a certain level of coordination now going across continents. On the issue of the pressure that ISIS is feeling, I'm seeing some signs on social media that they're worried about a backlash against them because they're saying things like, okay, don't post pictures of your atrocities anymore. Always go through us, because they're trying to clean up their image a little bit.
Can you imagine that? Frank, let me bounce back out to you, turn the corner just a little bit. Of course, Secretary of State John Kerry was leading this committee meeting that was happening today. President Obama will be leading a meeting next week. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, yeah, this is really kind of almost a curtain raiser as to what you might be seeing next week. You know President Obama is going to be including terrorism in his speech. You know he's going to be including the topic of the Ebola crisis in his speech. And, you know, this is just the tip of the iceberg as far as speeches when it comes to terrorism. A lot of people are going to be talking about terrorism in the region. We have Benjamin Netanyahu coming in from Israel, the Israeli leader. We also have Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinians. He's going to be talking. And so terrorism is going to cut across a lot of political lines here. Everybody's going to be saying, okay, we're against terrorism, you know, we want to help fight it, so forth and so on. But, you know, there's going to be a lot of finger pointing as to who may be responsible and who is providing arms for these people. And, you know, I want to get back to just what we were talking about a bit before on Iraq. And the stability or the instability of that country. It really is in a very, very bad, dire straits. It's in terrible shape. And I'll give you a good example. The former ambassador from Iraq to the United Nations, who left office just about 2 years ago, He didn't go back to his country permanently. He came to the United States. He's just settled here. He's now living here in the United States. He's not going back. He brought his entire family here. It's that dangerous for him back there. So you can see what is really going on, even among Iraqi officials, that they're very, very worried about terrorism.
Yeah, indeed. In our final 3 minutes, I want to just do a round robin with each of you. Frank, since I have you, I'll start with you. Just give me your perspective of what Secretary of State John Kerry has to do to put together the right coalition, because he really has been tasked with that. He's been in the Middle East just in this last week. And what arguments that he's going to have to make to bring on those who are reluctant. All right, Frank, you go first.
Well, as far as people that are reluctant when it comes to helping battle ISIS and terrorists, you're going to have a lot of people on face value saying, yeah, you know, we're with you, we're with the United States. And there's going to be people, you know, they have as many as 50 countries that have already stepped up to the plate before he made his speech and said to the U.S., okay, we want to help in any way we can. We want to help with maybe contributing some troops if there's some place to send them. We want to help with aid. We want to help, you know, send more aid to Iraq to try to help the people there that are threatened by terrorism. So he's not going to have a very difficult time in getting a lot of countries to contribute different types of aid to help battle terrorism and help support the people that are threatened the most by it in Iraq.
Let's go out to you, Eric. Your thoughts on that? And of course, I think the question is getting countries to provide enough resources to fight ISIS. Eric?
Right, and I completely agree with you. I think that's his central mission. It's not, he's got the countries already committed, but now he's actually got to get them to commit tangible things that can actually benefit both the country and the region. But more so than that, I think what they need to do is they need to be making sure that this coalition not only is there for the military campaign, but for the actual nation-building campaign that will be much longer and take much more resources to get done.
And then finally, Ryan Mauro here in our studio.
I think there needs to be more examination of the real weak point in the strategy against ISIS, and that's arming the Syrian rebels. I've interviewed some of the Syrian rebels. I know there are good secular democratic ones there that don't threaten us, but when I look at every single collection of rebels, inevitably I find Islamic extremists among them. And so we have to recognize that if we're going to be vetting and arming Syrian rebels, it is inevitable that some of those arms are going to get into the hands of Islamic extremists, and so we're basically going to have to create a new force from scratch.
All right. And with that, we'll have to be done. Thanks to Frank Uciardo, who joined us from the UN meeting, our UN correspondent. Thanks also to Arise contributor Eric Ham and to Ryan Mauro right here, our security analyst. I appreciate it. You've been watching an Arise News special report on the ISIS crisis. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry chaired the United Nations Security Council on the threat that ISIS presents to the world. The UN General Assembly meets this week and will broach this among many issues. Thanks for being with us. We'll see you on Arise America.